and welcome to the Books on Asia podcast, sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years, located at www.stonebridge.com. And I'm your host, Amy Chavez. Today we have with us Abby Denson. She is an award-winning author of Cool Japan Guide, The Cool Tokyo Guide, Kitty Sweet Tooth series, Tough Love, and her upcoming book is Uniquely Japan. A comic book artist shares her personal faves, discover what makes Japan the coolest place on earth. Now, Abby has scripted comics for Amazing Spider-Man Family, Powerpuff Girls comics, Simpsons comics, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, Josie and the Pussycats, Disney Adventures, and many others. So we are very happy to welcome Abby to the Books on Asia podcast today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I was wondering if we could start off with you helping define for our listeners the difference between Japanese manga, graphic novels, and American-style comics. And then maybe you can talk about where you fit into that.
Sure. This is a pretty deep question to start with. And my opinion is that the definitions can actually be kind of fluid and depending on the context. So, for instance, with when the expression graphic novel started to become popularized, a lot of people in the comics creating community had different opinions on it. Some people say graphic novel is only a good term for a fictional novel that is told in the comic style. And they might say something like graphic memoir for a nonfiction autobio thing. But personally, I can accept a broad usage of it, which to me would mean a general long form comic that is published as a bound book. So I would say I can say I'm a cartoonist or a graphic novelist. Manga is another term that would be used differently in different contexts because, for instance, if I'm in the US and I'm talking in English about the US comic scene and I'm talking about my comics, I wouldn't refer to them as manga. But if I was in Japan talking in Japanese about comics and my comics, I would call them manga. But when you're in the US comic scene, manga usually refers to comics that originally were published in Japan. So that's how I would divide that up. I think experts who academically study comics and manga culture would have all kinds of ways to put it, but that's a basic way. Another thing people could maybe call them is amekomi, which in Japanese is kind of how people refer to, I would say, superhero comics. So I probably wouldn't call my comics that if I was speaking in Japanese to someone. And then American style comics is also kind of an interesting way to refer to comics because, that could mean Popeye comics, Garfield comics, Spider-Man, Smile, Mouse, or like Fun Home. So that's a really broad range of kind of comics. So I think when it comes down to it, there are comics from Japan and US, and they're made in all kinds of styles. So if you get deep into both of the cultures, it's difficult to lump a visual style into a specific country category. But that's just, I know it seems like a simple question, but I wanted to give my insight as somebody who's been in the culture for a while. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, well, how about then I give my opinion as a reader?
Sure.
Okay, so living in Japan, I've often picked up manga in like the konbini, the convenience store, and looked at them. And there is certainly a great way to study Japanese. So I'm sure many other foreigners living in Japan have done this. And I think the attractive part of them for studying Japanese is that they're not text heavy. There are lots of drawings and they're done rather quickly. And the dialogue tends to be in a bubble and it's maybe a sentence or two. And there are lots of sounds, right, that they put in bubbles. And so that you can it's almost like reading a script. And then your eye just kind of flies across the pages rather quickly. And I suppose that also adds to the action of it. And they're black and white and very lightweight books. And what I really like about your book is actually the color, because although they stand alone easily in black and white, it's the color that brings the foreign culture to life. And it's easy, here's my cool Japan guide that I bought years ago. It says it came out in 2014, so that's probably when I bought it. And I just thought, what a terrific way to introduce Japanese culture, because if you just write it down, it's kind of boring and you don't have any context. Where here you get the colors and you get the shapes and you can almost smell these sweets on this page, for example. And
oh yeah.
In addition, you also introduce, of course, some of the mannerisms and the ways to do things. And I think, just as an example, almost every guidebook to Japan will tell you about how to take a Japanese bath the proper way. You shower first and then you get in. But with yours, you actually have the drawings showing each of the steps and how to properly cover yourself with the small towel that you have, cover your private parts.
Yeah.
So it does make a huge difference. But I feel like that is coming from an American background of comics myself and the color. And also, I was glad in your books that you do have a lot of text. You haven't gone light on the text and focused on only the drawings, because we need that. We need to know those little details that normally perhaps you wouldn't have to tell people, but because it's a different culture, you do.
Yeah, totally. And thanks for your compliments about the color usage, because that's part of the style that that kind of came naturally from my art. Just like I was inspired by manga, but I was also inspired by Keith Haring, and I was inspired by American comics such as Love and Rockets in my own style. But for color, I just really love like pop bright color. I like psychedelic posters. I like bright as you can get it color. So, and I think and I love drawing desserts. So thank you for also pointing out the desserts, because I did a dessert blog for a while where I was drawing desserts. So I love desserts. I love drawing desserts and all kinds of food. So that you might notice probably all of my chapters, the food chapters are the longest. And that's because it's just so fun. I'd say with the reason the manga, now my understanding has to do with the publishing practice of it, is that actually they usually have more space and more pages to tell the story because of the process of making manga, which is they have usually, especially if it's like a weekly manga, a lot more pages to tell the story. So their pacing can really stretch out longer. And you might call that, it's kind of decompressed storytelling. And in the US, it's a lot more compressed for US comics, the way they're made, typically, because a lot of times they're shorter page counts and you have to figure out how to get it all in there. And then especially because this is nonfiction, and I'm trying to get as much information as possible into each page, like knowing I have a limited amount of pages. It was definitely a challenge. It was almost like playing Tetris or something, where you're like, how can I fit all the information I want into this space, but also at the same time make the page look good? So it's a bit of a graphic puzzle, the process of doing that. And that's really different than doing a fictional comic. And even like a US fictional comic, which I've done, or a fictional graphic novel, there's usually a little more room to play. Like I wouldn't have such big chunks of text in the, as I would call like a narration box, which in the cool guides, there are a lot of boxes over an image that explains information. And that's a bit different than when Uniquely Japan is, which is, I think it's more multimedia than just a straight comic format.
Maybe you could explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, totally. So Uniquely Japan is actually kind of totally new kind of book project for me, because previously I was doing comics, which I would say were pretty straightforward comic narratives or comic nonfiction books, which had, narration boxes, speech bubbles, and word balloons, and it was all drawn like panel to panel. Uniquely Japan is multimedia because it includes photos I've taken, because I did go to Japan about every year for at least 10 years since 2010. And I gathered like a lot of photos. And I also have to shout out my friends, Matt, Yuko, and Stephanie, who they filled in some of the spaces with some of the photos I needed, with some that they graciously offered too. But I had a ton of photos, and I was thinking I really wanted to do a book that was almost more like a souvenir scrapbook that has comics and it has photos and it has illustrations, which to my mind is like a totally separate category than a comic page. And it also has text boxes that explain things. And it went from page to page, and each page integrates various media to show that information.
So that's your book that's coming out on April 5th, Uniquely Japan. And I love the very long subtitle. A comic book artist shares her personal faves, discover what makes Japan the coolest place on earth.
Yeah, it's always hard to come up with those subtitles.
I think that kind of really captures it, though. And I would have to agree that a lot of those things in the book are great. And I also really like that you have added in some tips. Like one thing I always tell people when they go out to eat is to get the teishoku, which is the set menu. And you have recommended that as well, because the teishoku, first of all, you don't have to make any decisions. Just give me the daily special, basically, is what it is. But it has all these cool things in it, a variety of foods, and you get to try a lot more things then. And you don't have to worry about, will I like it or not? Because there's small portions of many things. So if you don't like something, you can just move on to the next beautiful thing on your plate. Another thing about you were talking about having more space in the Japanese manga, that they have so many more pages, and they are quite thick books. And I noticed that Uniquely Japan is hardback, and it does have a little more volume than your previous ones, right?
I think it's a little bit longer. It's a little bit of a smaller book than the Cool Japan Guide and Cool Tokyo Guide, but also it is a hardcover book. And it's actually like a really beautiful, cute little book. So it makes a great gift or coffee table book. But at the same time, it's really fun. And I always find it very hard to define, my age range for books. So I always say, I think kids and adults would both like this book, and it's fun. And it's a good way to learn about different Japanese topics. And I was trying to put together something that included various cultural topics that I find interesting or enjoy about Japan, and to make it a little personal that way. So it's not just like a list of, here's some things about Japan everyone should know, like I like to bring a little passion. Like, I know I'm super pleased with my parfaits. I love parfaits. And in Japan, if you just can see in the windows of all the gorgeous parfait displays everywhere, I mean, I rarely would buy them because they're so big, but just as a visual thing, I find it so dazzling when you see the food models in the windows, which is also something that I usually talk about in my books. Like, it's one of my favorite things about going to Japan is seeing those things. And it might sound really trivial, but...
Well, it's a very visual culture, and especially when it comes to food, because they do have those plastic models.
Oh, yeah. Those dazzle me every time.
How does your new book, Uniquely Japan, differ from the previous books other than the formatting?
Well, definitely like Cool Japan Guide and Cool Tokyo Guide, those are guidebooks. They were conceived as guidebooks. So they actually have a lot of travel tips and information that is helpful for tourists who are planning their first trip to Japan. So that, to me, is what makes it very different, because Uniquely Japan, you don't necessarily need to use it for going on a trip. You can just buy it to learn about Japanese culture. Something kind of interesting about those Cool Japan books, cool books that I found out happened, is that a good amount of Japanese people were buying them in Japan and were being used to teach English in certain classes, which I didn't know. I found out when I was there and I did a signing at Kinokuniya, some people came and told me, and I was like, wow, that's amazing. That was like not what I thought would happen at all. But I'm really glad that they were being enjoyed by that audience too.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of looking at what is written in English to get the idea of what the foreigner thinks. And I remember I was contacted by the police one time. They were putting together a book of like tests for their incoming recruits, and they asked to use an article from mine from the Japan Times, because I wrote for the Japan Times for 23 years, and it was a story about how I had just gotten off the airplane and I had all this jet lag, and I lost an umbrella or something dumb, and I went to the police box, and I was just like melting in my chair. I was so tired and I couldn't even pay attention. And so they were trying to get the recruits to understand that foreigners, their level of patience and may be affected by jet lag and things like that. So I think it's a really good sign that they're, looking at these things that we write, because they are written from our unique perspective that the Japanese probably can't even imagine.
That's awesome. Since we're speaking about that, I did have a page about Koban in here, about police boxes, because that's something I think is really fun and exciting about visiting Japan, is that what I called street sites in the chapters, there are just some kind of things on the street that no one would think
I
to look
love
for.
that chapter. I love that chapter.
Yeah. Thank you. The Koban, the police boxes, a lot of them have really interesting architectural design or features. They look really different from place to place. And some of them are just almost cute. And I wanted to just mention that as something that, if you're just walking on the street, keep an eye out. There's always something interesting to see,
Yeah. And the manhole covers, which always get a lot of play on social media, but there's actually a history behind those, which I didn't know. So thank you for that.
Yeah, those are amazing. And that's something I really appreciate about being in Japan too, is what I call design motifs that are specific to different neighborhoods or shrines or temples or cities. If you're like, well, I'm in Nara, well, the motif is deer, and you just will see it repeated all around you. Like the souvenirs are deer, you might see a manhole with the deer, their cover with the deer, everywhere you look. So, or like if I go to Dazaifu, which is the I think it was an ume flower or ume blossom motif. There's just all these things, and I would very often take tons of photos of that stuff because I just thought it was so cool. Like as a visual artist, it really makes you feel like validated or something to see all these amazing graphic design everywhere. I feel like it's used so much more aesthetically and in a more visually pleasurable manner than in other places. So.
Absolutely. When I first came to Japan, which was like 25 years or so ago, I remember just being absolutely flabbergasted at the technique of laying tiles in Japan. Now, of course, there are other cultures that are famous for their decorative tiles, but these tiles aren't even really decorative. They're regular tiles, but just the way they've layered them with color or put them, in a nice serpentine pattern, or some of them are glossy and then the next one's rough. It just little things like that are so easy to do, yet someone thought to do them. And even like on the escalators, the handrails are blue.
Yeah.
There's little accents. And then, of course, the motifs and everything kind of comes together for this pleasurable experience.
Visually and aesthetically, there's a lot to appreciate. Especially if you keep an eye out for it, it's one of those things you might not notice unless you're looking at the manholes and you're looking at the train stamps and you're looking at, what the buildings, and suddenly you look all around you and you realize, oh, everything here is a picture of a deer. Everything here is a plum blossom, and then it kind of informs you about the history and, important things about where you are. And that's very cool too.
I'm glad you brought up stamps, because that was another thing in Uniquely Japan, is you have not only told people that at every train station, there's a stamp that you can put into your journal or on some kind of piece of paper, and there's ink there. And it has that motif that you were talking about in it, and it has the name and the date that you were there. I noticed you put quite a collection of them inside the bookend as well. Yeah,
part of the design of the book is the inner cover, or I think called end papers, have some of the stamps that we have collected or I've collected, and it's pretty cool. I think we got I like how it wasn't just me. You got the designers of Tuttle, so thanks to them too, and to Terry, my editor. So we all work together on that.
Actually, that's called a stambureri in Japanese. Where you
stamp rally.
Oh, yeah. Is that what it comes from? Stamp rally. I never even thought there was English. And you typically go around to wherever you go, there's a stamp rally for something. But the train station ones make the most sense for foreigners traveling, because they really help you, reimagine where you were and what day it was and what was there, and all those little reminders if you're keeping some kind of diary.
I wholeheartedly recommend if anyone's visiting Japan, definitely try, even if you're not an artist, making a sketch journal. Like, it is a cool idea to have a journal and put those stamps in it. And also, I mentioned here, like goshuin, which are stamps you can get at the temples or the shrines, though they have very gorgeous books that they sell there that you might want to also get as a souvenir. I know I certainly have, specific to those. But yeah, the train stamps, and you can definitely run into random stamp rallies almost anywhere, like a grocery store or on the street at a shopping arcade. Mm-hmm. They might be running a stamp rally where they're telling you, you know, go to like these 6 different stores and you get a stamp at each store in that shopping mall, or like a restaurant series. Like it's kind of like a cool promotion to promote the area. A lot of places do.
And the goshuin, the temple stamps on the Shikoku pilgrimage, it's quite famous for getting all 88 of the stamps from each temple that people do in Shikoku. But you can go to almost any temple has a goshuin. I say almost because whether the little office in your more local temples, they might not be open on the time you go. I think when I first came to Japan, I do believe that I had them do it right into my journal.
Yeah, I've gone with my husband to some, and some of them have drawn it directly into his sketchbook. I think once or twice they just instead like did a piece of paper and gave it to him. So I think it just depends on the location and if they have any kind of specific rules about it, or maybe if it just looks like, you know what, that paper is not going to take our stamp well, so let me just do a really nice one on our paper and give it to you. So I'm not positive of what the decision is on when they will or won't put it in your book. But I'll assume if you show up with a spiral bound lined paper, they're probably not going to draw in there. But if you have a nice sketchbook, they might.
Yeah, so. And the goshuin, it costs 300 yen. Whereas, of course, the train station stamps are free.
And one of the tips and tricks about that, I think I went into that more in the cool guides, but we got really into collecting them. And it kind of often would happen that you might not find it. So you actually, at many stations, we found a lot of times you have to ask the clerk at the station and they have it behind the counter. So if you are at and this is mostly JR stations, if you don't find the stamp, ask the clerk.
Yeah. And if it's a really, like if it's Nara or Miyajima, it's going to be right out there for sure. Can you give us an interesting backstory to one of your books? One thing I have noticed is that every book, there's a story behind it, right? Because nothing's really easy. And they're always like outside forces that come in to act, whether good or bad.
There are so many interesting stories, but I think that this one's, to me, one of the most interesting. And this has to do with my book, Kitty Sweet Tooth. This came out last year, actually. And it's a kids graphic novel that I collaborated on with the Tokyo-based artist Utomaru. So the backstory is kind of long and interesting in that I actually randomly met her at a bar in Tokyo. Well, it was like fate almost. And I'm really happy because I feel like she was such a great artist. I was really happy that it happened. But it was, I think, 2013. I like old horror movies. And I went to a bar in Golden Guy called Cambiare, which was, it's Suspiria themed based on the 70s movie Suspiria. So like the decor and stuff is based around certain horror movie themes in that movie, and they show 70s movies in it. So I went to that bar, and it happened to be like a lot of other cool writers and artists that happened to be hanging out there who I ended up staying in touch with. But one of them was Utomaru. And then several years later, I was preparing to pitch Kitty Sweet Tooth, and people who read the cool guides might recognize the character Kitty Sweet Tooth because she is in the cool guides. She's a purple cat with a cute yellow dress with a heart on it, and she helps with teaching phrases. But I wanted to do a fictional story about how she manages a movie theater. It has to do with desserts going crazy, and it's about how she, with the help of a witch and a misunderstood, not mad scientist, they all become friends, and they help her make a menu for the movie theater that she's managing for her grandfather. So it was kind of like an out there story, and I wanted to collaborate with a fun artist who I wanted to try to do a collaboration, not draw it myself. And Utomaru was like my top pick, and amazingly, it all worked out. Like I contacted her, she was up for working on the pitch. She did I showed her my character designs and then she showed me her character designs and like blew me away. It was so amazing to see that. I got the story together, got the pitch together. Eventually the book came out last spring and it's actually a series. So book 1, Kitty Sweettooth, came out last year. Our next book, Kitty Sweettooth Makes a Movie, is coming out this fall. So the first one, she's managing a movie theater where they're serving crazy desserts. And then the second one, she makes her own movie and she becomes a movie director. So, and they go all around the world. There's a lot of adventure. So I think that that's kind of a good backstory to show how meandering the process of trying to make a book is. I didn't even get into the deep detail, but it can take that long. Because if you're like, I met someone in 2013 and 2021, the book came out,
Right.
I think if you have stories that are kind of lurking in your mind that you want to do, and sometimes you just have to kind of wait and then take action when the time arises. But sometimes like the right person come right time. I didn't know I'm going out to a certain bar would result in making 2 children's books, but it happens.
Sometimes I think it's when you don't plan that the best things happen.
I think so. I think really following your passion, especially when it comes to your creative output, because it doesn't always pay off financially necessarily, especially like in the book publishing world. It's just something that you have to kind of do because you have something you're really passionate to share.
I was wondering if you could tell us your 3 favorite books on Japan.
This is so hard because I read a lot of different books. I guess these are going to be chronological in order. But the first one, I'm going to say Manga, The World of Japanese Comics by Frederick Schott, who you're probably familiar with. It was an early read for me around the time I was starting to become interested in manga in Japan. And I found it at my college library in the 90s. And I learned so much from reading it, and especially about the different genres of manga. It really inspired me. I recommend it. Everyone check out all his books. Definitely a fan of his writing. So I think that that's especially for people who are interested in manga. I could try to seek that out. The next one I'd say is Tokyo on Foot, which is a graphic memoir / sketchbook by Florent Chavouet, which I hope I pronounced right. I just really love his art style and the impressions of living in Japan. I related to it and it gave me nostalgia. I forgot, I didn't mention this earlier, but I did do a summer session at Sophia University when I was in college. So after I did that, I kept on wanting to return to Japan, and certain books or movies would make me feel nostalgic. Tokyo on Foot is really, I don't know, it kind of hit that button for me, and I recommend it. And then the third one is a new fictional graphic novel called Himawari House. And that's a gorgeous graphic novel by Harmony Becker. And it's a fictional story of 3 foreign exchange students who are living in a Tokyo share house. And I highly recommend it. It's really gorgeous. That also kind of hit that nostalgic feeling for me. It has really good character development. You get really deep into each of the different students' backgrounds and their personalities. It's actually quite long, and it is black and white, or it's monochrome, so it's a little bit more in that style you were talking about. But I really found it like a totally rewarding read, so I totally recommend those 3.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be really bold now and suggest what your next book should be.
Sure.
I would love to see you do a book on Japan's countryside. And the reason is, well, first of all, with all the tourism, the cities were just getting too many tourists. And there was this over-tourism problem. And I imagine that will come back again once the tourists come back after the pandemic. But the government is now really pushing the countryside. And there's so many cool things in the countryside. And not just traditional Japanese crafts, which I know a lot of people think of. And there's a lot of media being given to that. But I would like to see you do one of the inland sea and all the islands. And with the color that you have, I'm just thinking of these tiny, crops of rocks with red torii gates on them against a blue sea, and all I know that you, in Uniquely Japan, you introduced some of the, like the tanuki and the kappa and all those little characters. And there are a lot of those that are actually a part of Shinto and also Buddhism. And those things you'll see in the countryside much more often. You'll see not just the little statue of Jizo, who's the patron saint of children and travelers, but you'll also see Kanon, the goddess of mercy, and a lot of these other things that are integral to the way of life in the countryside. And also the food, because there's a lot of seasonal food and all of the festival foods. So you could have a great chapter on food as well.
I'm a little bit more of a city person than my husband, Matt, who is featured as a character in my cool guides. He's always saying that he wants to do more country stuff. So, obviously we're kind of can't wait to go back. Got to wait and see what happens with the tourism situation. I really hope we can soon. But since you mentioned it, did you see Florent's other book, Manabe-shima Island, Japan?
Actually, Manabe-shima is the same island chain that I live in. So it's 2 islands away. I go there all the time.
Amazing. So so that kind of, I also like that book as well. I have that too.
Yeah, it's great.
But that made me think of it a little bit, what you were saying. So, definitely, I would like to see a lot more. I think I'd be bold enough to maybe try to rent a car, but I'm not sure about driving. I haven't driven in Japan yet, so.
Well, you definitely need a car. Well, actually, no, you wouldn't. You can still get to a lot of the smaller villages on the mainland, and like the one-man densha, the one-man train, the one-car train. To get out to the islands, though, you got to get on a ferry.
Oh, yeah. No, I like going on ferries.
Good. Well, it has been a real pleasure having you on the show.
If people want to find me, they can go to abbydenson.com, and on Instagram and on Twitter, it's at Abby Denson, and that's ABBYDENSON.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, and good luck with your book launch. Everyone, get a copy of it. It's great. It's so much fun. It's the best way to be introduced to Japan. You've been listening to the Books on Asia podcast, produced and edited by Michael Palmer. Logo by Alex Kerr. Sponsored by Stonebridge Press, publisher of fine books on Asia for over 30 years. They can be found at www.stonebridge.com. Check out their latest book of Arcs and Circles, Insights from Japan on Gardens, Nature, and Art, essays by Mark Peter King. For more interviews, book reviews, and other features, visit the Books on Asia website at booksonasia.net.